I think you're right to use the word failure to characterize the overall situation in the UFO online culture. It's probably fair to say that right now, if there's any kind of UFO culture at all, it is an online culture. And therefore, it's not wrong to judge how human beings are currently grappling with the UFO problem by looking at this online culture. Now, it would be wrong to suppose that the online culture is the sum of the attempt, because there's reason to believe, of course, that there's some kind of official relationship or interaction with the phenomenon. And of course, we have reason to believe also that there's a widespread relationship of some kind between members of the population at large and whoever it is that's showing up at night in the bedroom and so on. So the sum of the human interaction, the sum of the human attempt to grapple with the problem, certainly goes past the current online culture. However, the usual overt attempt, the attempt in the usual overt sense, the cultural attempt, the obvious attempt, is probably limited to the internet right now. And just a survey of what you see online shows that I mean, it's not just a failure. It certainly is a failure, but it's the site of a catastrophe. You have you have kind of the wreckage of the previous UFO culture, which consisted of these kind of civic groups like MUFON and others. Back in the day when there was faith in civil society and belief that you could affect some sort of meaningful change through institutions, the natural thing for everyone to do was to start UFO organizations with committee structures and so on and so forth, and become official and become authoritative and try to interact with existing official authoritative institutions on their level. But coinciding, I think, with the collapse of civil society in the U.S. and the faith in any kind of civil society, now you have a lot of mercenaries. You have a lot of discrete individuals online, and some of them kind of bridge the gap between the two periods. Some of them were formerly in the group. Some of them have studied the material that has come out of the groups. Some of them continue to think of ufology as being something that exists because of the fact that in the past it did exist in some form in these groups. Today, however, I don't see the UFO organizations as having any kind of cultural impact. I think it's irrelevant to discuss them, other than in a historical context where we are acknowledging their past influence. Today, it's all happening online. It's all happening on blogs hosted by individual people. It's all happening on podcasts. And there's even a kind of complexity there, because I would suggest probably that it's true that maybe 10 years ago, the podcast scene was more entertainment driven and official in its own way. You had commercial shows that are attempting to make a buck by bringing all sorts of hosts on, or rather guests, bringing all sorts of books on with those guests. And now it's even further fragmented. So everybody who has a blog can also have his or her own podcast. And you have this new thing, especially in the past few years, where people who are so-called experiencers, people who've had these strange encounters, are cutting out even the middleman of the online podcast. They're recording their own audio. They're putting it online. And the result is, on the one hand, a pretty complete de-institutionalization of the human attempt, at least in the U.S. and at least in the way we're talking about, to come to grips with the problem. On the other hand, you have, in some cases, a pretty valuable oral history that's being created of the direct encounter with the phenomenon. These accounts of, firsthand witnesses, people who are directly involved, just speaking into their own microphones, recording it, putting it online, regardless of how bad the production values are. This is valuable. It's not, for example, what you get when an abductee, quote unquote, goes public for the first time, comes out of the so-called extraterrestrial closet, and is interviewed by an Ann Strieber who interrupts constantly and says, "Oh yes, I've heard that before," and disrupts the natural flow that the person is desperate to get into in explaining every detail as they remember it. Now that is kind of what you get from the more institutional, the more commercial kind of podcast environment of 10 years ago that's still around today. You get this filter that, has obvious drawbacks.
Well, it's worth noting, of course, that some of these institutions still exist. I mean, MUFON, obviously, the Joseph Allen Hynek Center for UFO Research, any number of others. There are support groups for experiencers or abductees. The preference for how they want to refer to themselves varies from individual to individual and group to group. But of course, whether they continue to exist might be irrelevant. The point you're trying to bring across is that, in a sense, these, or as I understand you anyway, is that these institutions have moved into a form of cultural irrelevance, or they may never, in fact, have been relevant, and it might, in fact, have been fundamentally misconceived to try and to form structures in a traditional mold around the experience. I'm not sure that what we see is problematic in the UFO community online is unique to UFOs, close encounters, conspiracies, and so forth. I think a lot of it carries over from other domains. I think that much of the fragmentation and the people erecting themselves as authorities and people forming camps around an individual who has proclaimed him or herself to be a font of wisdom, a reliable source of information, but who is in fact something of an amateur, who is in fact, a sort of zealous ideologue masquerading as someone who's providing an objective appraisal. This sort of thing, I wonder whether it's so much a product of the subject matter or whether the community that we're talking about is a special case of a more general problem.
Well, I don't think that online ufology is unique when it comes to these problems. The constant tribal warfare and authority-based belief and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, it's guilty. I mean, if one person commits a murder and another person commits a murder, yes, it's true that the first person who committed the murder is not alone, but nonetheless, he's a murderer. And in this case, what I'm saying is that there should be a kind of moral indictment given, especially the importance of the subject matter. The fact that even in this case where we're dealing with something that seems to be of really paramount importance. I mean, even in this case, human beings are dealing with it in the way that they're accustomed to. It's just warfare. It's tribal warfare. Now, my point in regard to MUFON and these other organizations is exactly that. They're no longer relevant when it comes to new discoveries and new ideas regarding this whole thing. I don't think that they have been relevant in quite a long time. For a brief period, they were a sort of honest, maybe even naive attempt to deal with the situation in a sort of natural way, a way that was natural to them at the time. I mean, you had these organizations form in the 50s and the 60s in the United States when people were forming organizations right and left about everything. And a certain amount of official interference pushed them into irrelevance, but also a change in the nature of the phenomenon seemed to push them into irrelevance. When you had institutions that were geared initially around studying lights in the sky and collecting data on these lights and when they were seen and where and what they did and how they behaved, when you had an entire institution geared up for that, finding all of a sudden that these strange little people are showing up in the bedroom at night, grabbing people, dragging them away, and so on, it just wasn't compatible. It wasn't something that they were prepared to cope with. So in many cases, I believe they rejected it out of hand. There was a keen reluctance to admit any kind of reality to the contactee or worse, abductee phenomenon on the part of these groups. And so they dug a hole for themselves as well, you know, on top of being sabotaged by official groups and or official types, they allowed themselves to slip into irrelevance. But the reason why the online culture right now has some value is because there is a kind of very small flicker of flame there. There's you know, something is very gently brewing. New people telling their experiences to others, and those experiences have new facets that others have not heard, and they give a new perspective on the phenomenon, and so on. So there is a little bit of synthesis and discovery going on. Unfortunately, it takes place against the backdrop of all this other crap, the websites, the message boards, the tribalism, the commercial aspect, which gets in the way, and so they're uniquely guilty in terms of the importance of the phenomenon that they're neglecting. But of course, you're right, they're not alone. If you go and look at the conspiracy subculture and you go to the JFK forums, you'll see the same thing. One website with one forum advocates a certain kind of theory. The posts have a certain kind of tone. There are tiny kind of subtle memes that get tossed back and forth just within the message board as a kind of code that allows the participants to signal to each other that they are, you know, on the same side. And it's very possible to get onto one of these forums and believe the exact same things and even pay explicit lip service to the same things. But if you don't give off or throw off the same tribal markers, if you don't phrase things in sort of comforting ways, if you indicate that you're not a part of the group, the tribe, the herd, even if you believe the same damn thing, pretty quickly you can fall into outsider status. And all of this, it gets in the way of, I mean, obviously it's not a particularly efficient way to develop our understanding of what's going on.
Well, you know, I think part of this exemplifies part of why the phenomenon might choose to address us as individuals. There's a memorable paraphrase of Nietzsche that I ran across a while ago. Madness is the exception in individuals, but the rule in groups. somehow
uh,
more plausible and more productive to deal with the individual, because the individual is tangible in ways that an organization is not. In a way, to address those organizations, you would have to become a part of human civilization anyway, which is something that they seem reticent to do, either because they want to exploit us in some way, or conversely, perhaps out of some kind of ethicality, perhaps because they don't want to undermine the momentum of our own self-directed evolution, because they don't want to threaten our cultural autonomy. Who knows? But it is clear that they are complicit in the secrecy. They could, I mean, the government may be entirely decades away from any even partial disclosure, but they could blow the lid on the whole thing any moment that they wanted to. So they're complicit in the secrecy. But I wonder whether or not our institutions even seem like something that could be addressed in a meaningful way to them.
I suspect that, on the one hand, from their perspective, the institutions are kind of irrelevant, but on the other hand, if they have studied us or observed us at all, especially prior to this, you know, perhaps failed encounter of the 50s or the 60s of the flyovers and so on and so forth, they would see their value to us. Now, there may be a fundamental incompatibility between them and our institutional culture, but I suspect, I guess what we're talking about here is whether they have some sort of objections based on accurate knowledge, or whether they are incapable of what we would consider accurate knowledge about the nature of our institutions. If, flying above in some sort of craft, you as a member of some other worldly civilization fail to see any of the recognizable cultural markers of central government or supreme authority or whatever it is. I mean, those are just two terms. It could be something totally different. Maybe they're looking for a gigantic temple, that stretches far into the sky, which is, the only thing they can think of as being a place where they could land and communicate. Some sci-fi scenario. There's all of those types of explanations on the one side, which suggest cultural difficulty and inaccurate knowledge on their part. On the other hand, there's a possibility that they have not only accurate knowledge, but more accurate knowledge than we do. They might see, for example, that what we call institutions are really specimens of sublated warfare, that basically all we're doing with these institutions is attacking each other the same as we did before the institutions, except now that it's been kind of sublated, it's been sublimated, and the behavior's been modulated, and yet essentially, maybe even spiritually, it's the same thing. You use a position of power to enrich yourself. You use your supposed authority to attack other people. There's always us versus them, divisions of wealth, etc., etc. And you can go even further and point out that, at least in English, the word institution does have at least a double meaning. An institution is something like the FBI or the CIA, but an institution is also the booby patch, the funny farm. You get committed to an institution, you're gone, you're crazy. And for that reason, I mean, you could at least point to that double meaning as suggesting that our quote-unquote official institutions are themselves internally divided between their apparent overt function and the actual reality, which is one of chaos and anarchy and warfare and abuse. There's no self-limitation, So it's, from the inside out, it's indistinguishable from the state of affairs you'd have if there were no institutions at all.
Well, the institutions strike me as something of a pretense in themselves. a lot of the high-minded rhetoric of our own society is really a thin veneer over the brutality that we commit abroad and the exploitation that we promote and protect through strokes of a pen in Washington. There's a lot of human ugliness that gets perpetuated under the banner of democracy. And it seems to me that you're right, that these institutions may very well seem like they're on a continuum with tribalism, with warfare, with the exertion of authority, and they're very little more than that. And they take them seriously. They might, because obviously they're not susceptible to the rhetorical sleights of hand whereby these institutions legitimize themselves to us, because they're really something much more base than we are led to regard them as. Old Greek maxim comes to mind: the strong do as they wish, the weak suffer as they must. And that's an axiom that seems as applicable now as it was during any prior epoch of history. You know, I think that when we go and we observe chimpanzees or gorillas, you know, we don't regard the alpha male with the veneration that the members of a group of apes might. And the apes themselves might be perplexed. Why don't they go to the alpha male? Why do they just to pick the
I've always wondered that, you know, with these people who say, why don't they land on the White House lawn? Well, did Jane Goodall go powwow with the alpha male? And, you know, of course not.
Right, right. So if they're looking at us as a population of animals, which is only one possibility, they could have a good deal more respect for us. It depends on whether we take an approach wherein we believe that they are strictly alien scientists here to harvest genetic material, or whether we believe they have an interest in the state of our consciousness, whether or not we are ourselves a kind of resource in virtue of our intelligence, in virtue of our creative capacity. Either way, the institution could be irrelevant to whatever reason that they're here.
Yeah, it seems that way, certainly. There seems to be absolutely no evidence that the institutions of our civilization have any kind of relevance when it comes to this encounter at this point. They're as irrelevant in a way as the MUFONs and the other UFO groups. Really, I mean, at this point, that's not to say that they've had no influence or no effect, but the site of the encounter has shifted from institutional, whether on their side interacting with our institutions or us interacting with each other through institutions. The encounter with this has shifted to something very different. And of course, it becomes much more bizarre at that point when you consider all of the individual accounts and the ways in which they differ from each other. It's very difficult to come up with an overall meaning to the encounter. At the same time, though, I really think that people make too much of the strangeness. This is already one of the problems that have been created by this UFO culture. You had the MUFONs and you had these other kind of civic groups, and they were created at a moment when the phenomenon seemed restricted to lights in the sky that couldn't be explained as natural phenomena. So they started off with kind of the thrilling premise that they're intelligently controlled, they're not ours, therefore, like us, they are, signs of beings traveling in some sort of conveyances to us. So they started to study it that way. Then, of course, the phenomenon shifted, and you started to have contactees, then you started to have abductions not long after that. And these institutions were unable to cope. So the phenomenon has shifted now to these individual encounters, each of which is uniquely strange, and overall, they seem to defy a pattern. Now, online, in the online culture, there's been a reaction against the previous UFO culture with its tendency to see the problem as simply one of lights in the sky. So, of course, they have created the straw man of the ETH, which they beat to death on all of these podcasts. And the ETH supposedly stands for extraterrestrial hypothesis. Now, as a hypothesis, it doesn't stand up very well because it's not something that's directly testable in a laboratory. So first off, if you're opposing something that you're calling the extraterrestrial hypothesis, you should at least recognize that the term you're applying to it, hypothesis, is somewhat loose. But secondly, this so-called hypothesis was only ever meant to describe the fact that some of these lights in the sky seem to be intelligently controlled, and therefore, if they're not ours and they're not the Soviets, presumably they come from somewhere else, beyond the Earth. That's what the term extraterrestrial means. And I've made the point to you, of course, but it's astonishing how generally illiterate people are. Today, on the podcast scene, in the reaction against the old UFO culture, you have all sorts of people lining up to take shots at the so-called extraterrestrial hypothesis, but these people online are pretending that extraterrestrial means aliens from other nearby planets, visiting us a la Star Trek. Now, this is a straw man, of course, because extraterrestrial is a negative definition. It's not a positive definition. Extraterrestrial simply means not from here, not from this Earth. So these chumps who keep throwing up the term interdimensional, as if that means something, and they're opposing the term interdimensional to the extraterrestrial term. The term interdimensional, if it's applying to a case where something is coming from somewhere else to here, also means extraterrestrial. If you are in a school in the United States, you will engage in what are called extracurricular activities. Now, extracurricular does not mean baseball. Extracurricular means outside of the learning curriculum. Could be baseball, could be football, could be anything. So here you have, this is a standard kind of sequence of culture. You have an initial premise, more or less, which then gets rejected in a kind of straw man fashion. And the way it's done is as confusing as it can possibly be. And now you have a kind of false debate between the two. Now here's why I backtrack and bring all of this up. It is true that if you look at a bunch of individual cases of contact, and you look at all the different stories that are told to the so-called abductees by these others about the nature of the universe and the future of mankind and where they come from and all this kind of crap, the stories are so separate on fundamental levels that they apparently can't be reconciled, and overall there does not appear to be a clear pattern. Now, a lot has been made of this, particularly in the work of this guy Jacques Vallée. On the podcast scene, you'll hear everybody ape and mimic Jacques Vallée. Oh, they set up Jacques Vallée as a kind of counter-authority to the classic ufology that started off believing that the phenomenon was restricted to lights in the sky. Well, Jacques Vallée wrote several books, and in some of these books, he really wrings his hands over the fact that these individual accounts don't add up to anything. There's no overall pattern. Now, I think we can agree with that. If you look at the individual cases he's looking at, it's perfectly natural and normal to agree. Yeah, these cases don't seem to have an overall pattern, and they seem to contradict each other in important ways. Nonetheless, it's possible to overemphasize the strangeness, and that's what a lot of these types are doing. These people who hold up Vallée as a counter-authority, and they wanted to enlist Jung and McKenna and these other guys, and they want a counter-authority against the old authority, and they want to mimic and ape the masters. And so they make so much of the strangeness of the encounters that only the wildest possible explanation can possibly hold. They're interdimensional, quote unquote. Well, what the hell does that mean? They're interdimensional. Well, so what? What if they come from a planet located in another dimension? Well, to these guys, I mean, they've never even thought of that. It's a question a 5-year-old would ask. But to them, they've already gone all in on the idea that extraterrestrial means from another planet, especially nearby, and interdimensional means to them some sort of strange, incomprehensible realm, maybe that consists only of information, maybe that, you know, to use a term from our buddy Kephas, is imaginal, you know, where it's just this ether that you construct a reality from, provided you have a consciousness and so on and so forth. So each explanation is valued based on how wilder it is than the last. And, you know, because it's so strange, this phenomenon, only the strangest possible explanation will encompass it. Well, of course, this is all nonsense. I mean, they are not reasoning from the apparent facts. They're reasoning based on a certain tendency and direction that they want to take themselves in culturally as a subculture. They want to introduce, you know, the psychedelic themes. They want to have a home for the psychedelic experience. They base, you know, they draw too strong an analogy between contact experience and psychedelic experience. And so what do you have? I mean, you have one subculture warring against another subculture. You have warfare. You have people banging each other over the head with these phrases and these cliches and these notions which they don't understand really themselves, but which they employ anyway. So if there are UFOs in, I'm sorry, if there are institutions in ufology today, namely the online culture, the institutions consist of these websites with these hosts who've read a few books, have formed some ideas, parrot people smarter than themselves, and just like our giant institutions, these tiny institutions engage in tribal warfare. And if they proceed or learn anything, generally it's as if by accident.
Well, I think you're right, and I think I especially agree with your invocation of the psychedelic culture toward the end of what you were just saying. I think there's a substantial bleed through that can account for much of what we see. We have the New Age culture. We have the culture of psychedelic enthusiasts. We have the UFO culture. We have pagans and astrologers and hermeticists and you know, people who are looking for some kind of shamanic, archaic revival. There are overlapping but distinct families of interest that make up what we might call this kind of metaphysical counterculture. And there's a lot of bleed through into the UFO domain from there. And I think a lot of that, or at least some of that, is perfectly legitimate. People, I've heard it voiced in some of these blogs and forums, well, you know, it's really remarkable that, you know, people who have an interest in UFOs also generally seem to have an interest in all of these other forms of altered states of consciousness and so on and so forth. And I think that to a great extent, that's a sociological sort of epiphenomenon. I mean, there's some reason for that. There's even substantial reason for it, but a part of it is because once you've rejected one aspect of consensus reality, or you now identify yourself as someone who's part of the avant-garde of working against the default metaphysics of our society, you'll tend to want to get involved in the other things. It's very much like, one thing can be a gateway drug to the others. Quantum mechanics can be a gateway drug to being interested in channeling, which can be a gateway drug to being interested in UFOs. So there's this bleed through. And the problem is that there are varying degrees of legitimacy in all of these things. While I'd certainly say that mysticism and certain forms of occultism and various other kinds of spiritual practice have varying degrees of legitimacy, a lot of it is pure bunk. And nobody who's involved in this has philosophical training, and even without philosophical training, it's not as though very many of these people are choosing to exercise elementary critical thinking skills. And so all of it gets assimilated into a homogeneous pile of colorful, well, maybe not homogeneous, but a strange mix. And it bleeds together, and we wind up with much of what we have. I also think that the tendency toward rebellion, toward wishing to define oneself as being against something, plays a significant role. And I think you're also right to point out that it's significant that this is a counter-revolution in many ways to the UFO subculture that was more preeminent when this was about lights in the sky and strange disks and so on and so forth. It brings to mind a bit from Michel Foucault, if I can defer to a quote from him for a second. Quote, "I think there is a widespread and facile tendency which one should combat to designate that which has just occurred as the primary enemy, as if this were always the principal form of oppression from which one had to liberate oneself." End quote. And they're taking up the ufologists of the 50s as if they're the boogeyman. And because they're addicted to this feeling of being against, of being at the edge, they have to push further to the edge and get stranger and stranger until interdimensional won't be enough, until it won't be enough until, the hypotheses vary widely. And what we're facing, I believe, is a problem of what philosophers of science call underdetermination. And underdetermination is the idea that for any given set of data, there's not a finite set of potential explanations, because the explanation can always be modified to add some kind of additional provisional hypothesis, or part of the explanation could be subtracted to accommodate for the data. But if you're no longer committed to fundamental rationality, the total number of potential explanations is infinite. If you're willing to add on to them or subtract from them indefinitely. And this field might very well be more radically underdetermined than anything that science has to deal with, because in even talking about extraterrestrials and conspiracies, we open up the door for things that would be ruled out of account on Occam's razor. Because we're talking about the ability to move at or near the speed of light. We're talking about beings that have a culture that could be thousands, even millions of years older than our own. We're talking about clandestine government organizations that have tremendous budgets and the means and the motive and the opportunity to keep all of this secret and to back engineer it for whatever purpose they can dream up. And the possible explanations are, the sky is the limit. So if it's this radically underdetermined, people can go anywhere they want with it. And I think that their addiction to defining themselves as against something pushes them further and further.
It does push them further and further. You know, again, talking about this in terms of what these other visitors might know about us that we don't know ourselves. You know, it's been noted before that human civilization, and in particular human institutions, can obey a law of murder the father. So you have to depose the existing authority in order to set yourself up in his place as the father, as the authority. And it's not so hard to see in the case of this, counter-reformation in ufology, a desire to set themselves up as the new authority, having slaughtered the old authority. And then, of course, it gives rise to the question, well, you know, is there a pathology there? Is there a pathology of wanting to be desired, wanting to be seen as an authority? And I think there's abundant evidence for that. You have the fact that there's a lot of imitation of academic practice and academic language in these UFO, paranormal, conspiracy type books and so on, without actually ever achieving the level of acumen that is often shown in academic publications and so on. You have a definite predisposition on the part of many to put themselves out in front of the crowd and say, I found the answer. Oh, I have this discovery, and only I was smart enough to find it. You find that a lot. And that's just one aspect of the general egotism that you find, you know, in people who are visible in these subjects. So it's all the standard contours and dimensions of human institutions again. However, there's a term that you mentioned earlier which I think is important in discussing this, and that's identification. Because when I was talking about mimicry or imitation earlier, another way you can term that is identification. Apparently, people have a basic desire to identify with something out of a more basic fear or insecurity. So you have a lot of people who, if they listen to a podcast, if it's agreeable with them pathologically on some level, they will identify with the host or hosts. Then they'll participate on the website or the forum. Having identified with the host, they will mimic certain aspects, certain perspectives, certain positions on the issues, and then go to war on the forums, now identifying with those people or with those grand masters. Now, if those individual people had a little more ambition, or maybe if they thought there was a chance, they might try to depose the existing authority and set themselves up as authorities instead. But you do have no shortage of followers in general in human society and on websites. But the fact is that despite these small instances, relatively small instances of identification, where you have people identifying with the master, identifying with the gestures of the master, and so on, the UFO culture, the paranormal culture, the fringe culture surrounding these subjects, from a higher perspective, seems to provide abundant obstacles to identification. In other words, given how messy and complex the UFO culture is with the New Agers and the psychedelic types and everybody else, given how complex it all is, it is hard to identify with a single unitary truth that defines the entire subject. You can pick out a very small identification and stick with it, but it's partial. The encounter as a whole, the UFO encounter, the otherworldly encounter that we're presuming that we're engaged in, right now there's still no single overall victorious identification that you can make. You can't identify with a single quote-unquote truth about the phenomenon. So, given that that may be the case, it raises the question of whether that is not intentional. You mentioned earlier the idea that these others control the secrecy. Well, if they do, and it's not unreasonable to think that they do, maybe this is its own kind of outcome. It may be the case that this UFO culture, which is now dominated by people who are crazy and people who are hucksters and people who have these pathological desires to be authorities, like the Hoaglands and others. This is, in a way, the worst of human society, but it also perfectly reflects human civilization as a whole because you see the same patterns of behavior. But because it's a restricted, circumscribed domain, it may, in a way, be a kind of laboratory for testing or producing the encounter that we're talking about on a smaller scale. So you have these eminent representatives of human civilization, all these nutcases and criminals and all of that. And this is the crucible where the encounter is being learned and grappled with and understood. And to these others, there's no contradiction. I mean, you couldn't come at us in an overt way with the institutions, so you decided to come at us on a smaller scale way, if anything, under more controlled circumstances.
Well, that calls to mind another passage from the Key. The desire to lead is a symptom. The very people who are propping themselves as authorities are the very sort of people that represent the worst of what we have to offer as a species, as a society.
Well, that's no doubt true. It's absolutely right to bring that up. It's possible that in the minds of these others, the sins of being in one of these giant civilizational engines, these institutions, those sins are far worse than the sins of egotism and stupidity and so on that we see in these online forums and surrounding the UFO culture today. So naturally, they might have a kind of abhorrence of our institutions and the desire to avoid those people. There might even be a basic incompatibility where, because of the nature of their consciousness and the nature of ours, it's actually somehow physically impossible for them to relate in the way they would like to these people, the Janet Napolitanos or the Bill Clintons, these types who are causing so much suffering and sin, driving the institutions. Maybe they can't deal with them. So here we are, they're dealing with the crazies instead, the ones with no power.
Sure, it's an off-cited fact. Well, I don't know if you could really call it a fact, but it's an off-cited claim that if one group of people carries out a parapsychological experiment, that's, of course, an experiment where consciousness is trying to influence the output of a random number generator, or how a coin happens to fall, or something like that. That would be sensitively dependent on the consciousness that's adjacent to it or that's focused on it. And it's often claimed that if one group of people carries out an experiment and they believe in psychic phenomena, they will get positive results. But the reason why skeptics have a hard time replicating the experiment is precisely because they don't believe in psychic phenomena, and so they give it just enough of a nudge that they don't get a significant deviation over chance. And very much connected to what you're saying is another bit of UFO lore is that the physicist John von Neumann might very well have warned people in a position of power within the government that mass belief in the existence of these entities could cause them to be able to manifest. And so, therefore, since we can't know what would happen if they were to come through, since we understand so little about them, or maybe because the government understands something about them and it's malign or adverse reality. I mean, we don't know. I mean, we don't even know if this occurred, but let alone what they might or might not know or believe. But it gave them an additional motivation for pursuing the secrecy. But all of this, I think, I'm leading us away from the main thrust of our conversation. I would comment that ghettoization really accounts for a lot of the mess that we see, and I think that it's probably an accidental victory on the part of the intelligence community and whatever other interests might be concerned with keeping this subject off the radar of the population at large. Because if you can successfully label a topic as crazy, then you can ensure that people won't talk about it. I've heard one yarn that the OSS was responsible for starting the National Enquirer and other similar tabloid magazines, which is not implausible in light of some of the other documented activity of the intelligence community. Think, for example, of the CIA starting Radio Free Europe and things like that. But the theory that I have in mind is that they would run these UFO stories adjacent to pulp stories and sort of trashy celebrity gossip.
Bigfoot got my daughter pregnant, that sort of thing.
Right. In order to give the entire domain a flavor of something unseemly, of something beneath the contempt of any intelligent individual. And, it's something that you find across the board when the UFO appears in fiction. Within seconds. I remember there was an episode of The Brady Bunch. It was a perfect sort of rendition of this. I think I saw a UFO. It must be swamp gas. And across the pop cultural appearances of the UFO that weren't science fiction, anything that's depicting ordinary people in an ordinary life situation, like a sitcom, like a television drama, like a commercial, if it's not science fictional where it's suspending disbelief, within seconds, someone will say, well, that's absurd. You must be crazy. You must be on drugs. You must be drinking moonshine. Who knows? The fact of the matter is, there's been this contextualization of the topic as something crazy, which means whether or not people believe it, they won't bring it up in casual conversation. I've seen varying studies of the percentage of the population that believes that we're being visited, or that the U.S. government is concealing knowledge of the existence of extraterrestrial life. And in a couple of these studies, the numbers are pretty high, 77%, 80%. And I think the way we can, this is an interesting data point, because that says people believe that this is the case, but they won't talk about it because they expect ridicule. And that fuels the ghettoization of the subject. And the ghettoization of the subject opens it up for opportunists, like the sort of people that you're talking about, for schizophrenics, for all number of other forces that can poison the well, that can further ghettoize the subject. So you have this feedback loop which ensures the absence of progress. Now, personally, I don't think that the forces concerned with secrecy are intelligent enough to deliberately engineer something like that, which is why I called it a kind of accidental victory. But a victory it is, nonetheless.
Well, it's very interesting what you're saying, and there are a number of things that come to my mind. And one in particular, I hope we can get to as being quite an interesting topic. But there is evidence that, at least early on, the CIA, for example, did attempt to not only control perception of the UFO issue, obviously, and to make it, something that only results in ridicule when you bring it up and so on. But that they then, of course, having succeeded at that, would try to tie, JFK assassination research to the same perceived kookiness, so on and so forth. But, what's so amazing to me is that they can't possibly win. I'm not talking about some sort of crusade of light that results in disclosure. I don't think disclosure as it's understood by these exopolitical types, is ever going to happen. I mean, the government doesn't tell the truth about anything, even the smallest thing. And even when it tells the truth, it's by accident because it's still a calculated statement. So why would they tell the truth about some gigantic issue like this? They lie about everything. They lie about military coffins. They lie about potholes. So it's absurd to expect this grand moment of disclosure. I think that they're not wrong, these people, for wanting it, because what they are really saying is, we still believe in civilization as a collection of institutions. We want our institutions to reflect the reality of our experience. So it's kind of this good-natured, I'm a good citizen approach, which I don't think they should be ridiculed for, by us. But nonetheless, I don't think it will succeed. Put all that aside, the idea that these intelligence types can imagine that they can win against these other people astonishes me, because given what little we're led to believe about the psychology of these others, I'm certain they do not have a single soul victory condition. This encounter between us and them is going to take place no matter what. And it is taking place no matter what. And given what we can imagine is their experience of the quote-unquote world, of time, space, creation, God, everything else, especially as illuminated by a book like The Key, again, I don't think that there's a single victory condition that they're trying for. Just as when they communicate linguistically, it's overloaded with many possible meanings. I'm sure that they will be satisfied with many, many possible different outcomes when it comes to this encounter, and that spiritually or intellectually they will reconcile themselves to a complete failure in the encounter in the same way and be satisfied ultimately with that. It's not a question of conquest in the way that one human group will attempt to conquer another human group and have certain specific finite goals as their short-sighted victory conditions, like, well, we took most of their women, or we killed most of their men, or we took their land, or whatever it is. The total landscape of possible victory conditions for them is probably immense. And the idea that these intelligence types think that they can play that game, that's astonishing. Again, consider that what we're proposing here, that the ghettoization is itself a kind of success, perhaps, for these others. I mean, they're going to succeed no matter what. They can turn any partial defeat into a larger victory because they're more flexible. They see more. Over the scope of time, they see more. They understand more. Again, I'm not saying they're all-knowing, but these idiots, I mean, they think that they can resist. And in the key, for example, it says, you should go from basic stance of, public secrecy and secret defiance to open public defiance. Paraphrasing, of course. Because that's the only possible position you can hold and have any success. The old story of Archimedes saying, give me a lever big enough I can move the earth. If you have a civilization under potential quote-unquote threat from an outside, if you segregate off a small part of that civilization and invest in that small part maximum control of the whole, well, then you give these outsiders the perfect lever with which to move and control the civilization. I mean, everything now geopolitically is moving toward total state control, police state in the United States and the Western countries, so on and so forth, the total secrecy and blackout when it comes to the UFO issue, everything else. So you've got like a civilization within a civilization, a mini civilization. In the U.S. alone, you've got 5 million security clearances. And of course, you've got these other idiots who are anti-conspiracy saying, oh, no one can keep a secret. 5 million security clearances prove that wrong. But nonetheless, if you have this tiny, select, elite group that's enabled to exercise complete control over everybody else and dominate and oppress them, well, then these others, since they don't seem to be interested in our usual brand of conquest, they can control everything by controlling the controllers. So in a certain sense, you might imagine that these morons, these too clever by half intelligence types, are doing exactly what these others are happy for them to do. These others might not initially desire it, but again, if you act like an asshole, somebody else who is in a true position of mastery might be perfectly satisfied that now you've acted like an asshole. Okay, we'll deal with that situation. Their mastery won't be threatened in any case.
I don't think that disclosure is completely impossible, but not in the way that it's typically imagined. I think disclosure will come from one or two sources: the visitors themselves or a public groundswell. And when I say a public groundswell, what I mean is something like this. Notice that in the period of time prior to Occupy Wall Street, you would never hear anything in the media about income inequality, for example. You would never hear anything in the media. Well, I guess you would hear some things about, how the dirty dealing of hedge fund managers and investment bankers and so on. But income inequality, struggles of class, that was something that was totally outside the scope of mainstream discourse and news media, right? But now people talk about it. And there was no objective decision, okay, we're going to talk about income inequality on TV, we're going to talk about class struggles on TV. It was that it became impossible not to talk about it. And I think it is possible to pass a certain threshold of public outcry where it just become absurd to deny it anymore. And it's also likewise possible for the visitors to make themselves manifestly apparent enough for it to be absurd to deny it. So I think disclosure is possible under those terms, but you might call it disclosure light, or you might call it, the government being dragged along disclosure. But that being said, I think that you're absolutely right that it's absurd. It's an example of extreme hubris for these intelligence types to believe that they could defy the agenda of these other beings. But I mean, everything that the intelligence community and the corporate sector does is an act of extreme hubris. The idea that you could wage a war on drugs or a war on terror, an amorphous enemy that has no leader, is absurd. And in the case of terror, it only ends up creating more terrorists, at least in the way that they're pursuing it by, well, I won't go into that, but take the hubris of what we're doing to the environment. I mean, obviously, if ExxonMobil and Shell and BP and the Koch brothers spend so much money on discouraging belief in anthropogenically motivated global warming, they're obviously aware that this is happening. But their interest is in their short-term profit. And all across the board, what these types of people do is fanatical hubris. It's to believe that your profit can somehow protect you against the disintegration of the entire ecosystem is madness on a proportion such as I couldn't even imagine. I mean, they talk about how people, I don't know where it comes from, but there's this phrase, 1,000 philosophers sitting in a room for 1,000 years wouldn't be able to dream up quantum mechanics. If I were to gather the most pessimistic people to sit around for a long damn time to imagine what is the most destructive acts of hubris that you could imagine people in a position of power doing, I don't think they'd be able to match the degree of insanity that is regularly coming out of Washington and Wall Street.
Everything you say is true, and it's interesting from another slightly different point of view too. I mean, these intelligence types are, from as best we can tell, I mean, they're not only out of their minds to think they can oppose these others. And I'm not advocating slavery. I'm not advocating that kind of mindset. Again, it's a false choice. But what they are effectively doing in their hubris is advancing their own reality of their own little subcultural experience over all of the possible other realities in which this encounter might occur across mankind. And that is further evidence of the hubris. In other words, let's say that there are a few intelligence types who are acting in a way that they believe is an attempt to grapple with the issue. And it goes in both directions, whether it's them affecting our own civilization in order to grapple with the issue, and them trying to affect the human encounter with these others. What they're doing, all they're doing is they're applying their own intelligence training, their own presumptions about the way the world works, their own beliefs, implicit or explicit. They are advancing themselves as the medium. All they're doing is advancing themselves as the conduit through which the encounter must pass. Of course, they don't realize it. They think they're acting as a kind of totally neutral third party between us and them. They think they're trying to manage it, but really all they're doing is advancing themselves as the final determiner of truth when it comes to the encounter. They are making the encounter an encounter between that of otherworldly beings and intelligence types. So, I mean, without knowing it, they are inserting themselves into the frame and they're dominating, and that is an even more sickening example of hubris.
Well, you know, it's a terrible shame, all of it. But as you've noted, all of this is going to go in the direction that it's going to go. But personally, you know, I think that there's enough evidence that the beings are not entirely of adverse intent. You mentioned that Vallée notes the absence of pattern in the close encounter phenomenon taken as a whole. But, I mean, there are people who say things differently, like John Mack, for example. He notes that there are at least 3 strands that you can identify running through the phenomenon. One is the collection of genetic material. Another is perpetual warnings about ecological catastrophe and nuclear catastrophe. People are very commonly shown a screen or given a vision or set into some kind of holographic immersive experience where they see the breakdown of the environment because of pollution or global warming or deforestation or whatever nightmare scenario, or they see nuclear bombs going off. And so that's the second strand, these warnings. And the third strand is this tendency of being open to some higher dimension of reality, of coming into contact with what you might call the source, or becoming aware of the interconnectivity with the rest of life, or what have you. And those 3, even though there's tremendous variation in the experiences themselves, those 3 seem to run through a lot of it. And taken that way, it looks like the beings themselves might have our interest at heart. I mean, if they wanted to protect the environment but not us, they could wipe us out. No questions asked. Very easy to do. You know, a civilization that can have interstellar travel, all they'd have to do to wreck our civilization is drop sufficiently massive meteors into the ocean to create tsunamis, because most of our major cultural centers are in coastal cities. So if they wanted to wipe us out, easy. So they clearly care about us and the environment, if these stories are to be believed. We are of some value to them, or our society is, because they could, you know, crash our society with electromagnetic pulses and leave the people alive. So our culture seems to be of interest to them. Our planet seems to be of interest to them. And there's this spiritual component to it. So I think that the visitors are not entirely malign. I think we can say that with some confidence. And if the ball is in their court, you know, that's favorable for the prognosis of our society. And also, we need to realize that the ball is in our court. the intelligence types, the military types, the corporate types, they would like to project an image of themselves as something monolithic. They would like to present an image of themselves as something unimpeachable. But the fact of the matter is that there's more of us than there are of them. You know, the fact of the matter is that they're able to maintain control only by promoting ignorance and apathy. A favorite metaphor of mine is that, you know, if you take a baby elephant and you tie it to a post, it'll learn pretty quickly that it's not strong enough to pull the post out of the ground. But as it matures, it reaches a threshold where it is indeed strong enough to pull the post out of the ground and run away. But it's learned the lesson already. It's ingrained the idea that it can't escape. And what we're in a similar predicament. And if we could pass a similar critical threshold in our awareness, we could recognize that the forces that are trying to subvert the emancipation of the human species are a lot weaker than they purport themselves to be. And all this could take a turn for the better.
Comparing, let's say, the accounts published and the interpretations published by John Mack with the accounts published and analyzed by Vallée is kind of interesting. It's interesting that you bring it up. I think, obviously, one main difference between the two is that they're looking at two different data sets. Vallée seems to kind of straddle the line between the contactee era and the abductee era. And to the extent that those are two separate things, Mack belongs more firmly in the abductee era, and the three themes that you mentioned, I think, are perfectly accurate. Vallée, and maybe simply because he's French, found it much easier to perceive in the accounts that he was examining an ongoing absurdity. I mean, he uses the term absurdity because in one case someone will declare that he's from Venus and say that he's come down to just talk to you and to tell you these things, and you have this entire wacky set of explanations about their civilization and ours and so on and so forth. Somebody else will claim that he's from Mars. You have all of the silliness and the kind of weird proto-New Age stuff of the contactee era, along with all sorts of weird behaviors when it comes to encounters themselves that don't involve a lot of communication. You know, flying saucer lands next to a highway, and, you know, three little guys jump out with shovels and start digging into the earth. They pick up some dirt, and then they run off. It's absurd that they would land next to a highway. That's not even the best example. I mean, so many things that are described are so patently absurd on their face when it's considered what their evident intention was, that you think, what the hell is actually going on? But the absurdity does continue. I started reading for the first time the other day Missing Time by Bud Hopkins. And, you know, I've avoided UFO books like the plague for a long, long time. But recently, judging myself immune enough, I've started looking at some of them. Of course, the book is nowhere near as dogmatic as these counter-reformationists like to claim. It's actually a pretty mild, somewhat intelligently written collection of anecdotes, and it's perfectly harmless, the book. But one of the first accounts that are described in details is the account of a guy who, and this now belongs more in the abductee era, and of course the book Missing Time, depending on who you ask, inaugurates the opening of the abductee era with its publication. Well, I may be wrong on that. There may be a previous book by Bud Hopkins that does. Anyway, we're no longer really in the contactee era anymore. Here's a case of a guy who claims, through recall, aided by hypnosis, that he's in a car driving through the Maryland woods, home from work. It's an hour-long drive. You know, he undertakes it every night. His car is pulled over to the side of the road as if by some powerful magnet. It's jerked over there. And the next thing he knows, he's outside of the car, and he's being held standing in place by some sort of giant clamp that is like a huge hand that grips his right shoulder. And he can kind of turn around and see it, and surrounding him are like 2 or 3 grays, whom he describes in detail, and it's very convincing. There's one gray who's kind of in charge, and there's another gray who's digging with like a shovel next to the tire of his parked car. And it looks as if this little creature is not really terribly strong, and it's taking him a long time to dig this hole for an unknown reason. Meanwhile, the gray in charge is getting pissed off that everything's taking so long. And that is basically the extent of the encounter. Now, what the hell is the point of pulling this guy over, holding him with this giant clamp? Now, if it's assumed that these creatures, these people, are more or less of the same group who come and, induce sleep paralysis and put people to sleep, why do you need this huge, extreme, exotic clamp? And what the hell are you digging in the earth for next to the highway? I mean, the guy in his account says he couldn't understand it because off to the right, 50 or 60 yards, there was kind of like a depression and there were woods. So if these guys wanted to stay out of sight, presumably the soil is the same 50 yards over, they could go over there and dig the hole. Now, yes, it's true that we don't know all of the facts, and therefore there may be no inconsistency at all if we actually knew all of the facts. There are human practices which seem totally inconsistent and absurd when you look at things from a certain angle. I mean, on the one hand, technologically we have iPods and iPads and iPhones and computers that communicate wirelessly over the internet, so magical technology. On the other hand, the only way we can cure a cavity in a tooth is to drill a massive hole in it, fill it with molten metal. And, sometimes, I mean, we even amputate. Someone has diabetes or a limb is mangled. There's nothing else we can do but cut the damn thing off. So the very reasonable and sensible exists alongside the apparently unreasonable and insensible. But putting that aside, if you take that account of the apparent absurdity of his experience, and you set it next to all these other experiences which are similarly absurd, but in relationship to the others suggest contradictions that seem to not simply, they're not just on their own hard to comprehend, but that in underlying ways they all seem to contradict each other. Then you have the exasperation of somebody like a valet who throws his hands up in the air and says, maybe all of this is just intended as a kind of deception, which is an interesting thesis. Of course, that's on one side, and you have, on the other side, a more coherent set of data when it comes to the abduction phenomenon. You have the themes pointed out by John Mack, as you rightly mentioned. You have overlap between those experiences and those interpretations and somebody like a Strieber, who has much more vivid and also strange experiences, but still the themes run through. So I don't know if you can reconcile the two, but it's significant, I think, that there's a difference between the kind of the two visions that maybe cannot be reconciled, at least at present.
Well, I mean, there are a couple things that come to mind if we're going to try to keep it simple. One is like screening things out of our data set. I think that for the most part, and you know what, maybe I haven't dug into it enough, maybe I'm not being fair, but I think that most of the contactee stuff probably represents either deliberate falsification on the part of the experiencers or some kind of unconsciously directed confabulation at best. I think that we could probably screen a lot of those out of hand. And even within the abduction thing, some percentage of the stories that we're dealing with have to be falsifications. We don't know what is real and what is false. I mean, we would have to do an exhaustive comparison of the strangeness of the story versus the credibility of the witness, the existence of corroborating witnesses, whether or not there are physical marks. An easy way to hone down the data set to see what we're dealing with is something Strieber has suggested, which is focusing on the experiences of the people who can be shown to have objects in their bodies, because that would cut it down pretty neatly and give us some more confidence that we're dealing with an authentic story, and it would be less contestable whether or not it's authentic. But because there's such a high degree of unreliability in the witnesses, it's hard to say exactly where this strangeness represents something having to do with the visitors themselves and where it's the product of the imagination of the people who are claiming to have experiences. But
I used to think as you do until very recently, because if you compare the kind of human richness of the abduction stories, their consistency and so on, with the almost cartoonish sci-fi oriented stories of the contactees and so on, I mean, there's no comparison. And certainly in terms of anything that's intellectually satisfying, the abductee era is the way to go. I mean, if some blonde person shows up and tells you he's from Venus and so on, well, right now we have no reason to believe there is any civilization on Venus. So you're right. I mean, first off, you'd think it's false. However, there is a considerable amount of corroborating evidence for a lot of these contactee accounts. And the guy comes away telling his Venusian story, and there is like a giant circular burn in the field outside that apparently wasn't done by him, et cetera, et cetera. That's just an example. And, you have cases like the Billy Mayer, where he's probably 99% full of bullshit, but there may have actually been some authentic encounters. So it raises the question of whether the encounters actually did take place and whether these other people weren't just bullshitting the contactees and telling them a lot of crap. I mean, they could be being perfectly faithful, in which case then you have to ask the question, why? And looked at another way, I mean, why would it be that in the 50s and 60s, every human being who encountered these people were full of crap, and yet now suddenly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they're giving us more or less truthful accounts? It's hard to imagine why there would be quite such a difference. I mean, what, were people significantly stupider then? Were they more prone to lying? It would be hard to explain, harder to explain the apparently obvious difference between the two types of experience. If, because there ought to be just as much stupidity. The Venusians should still be making appearances today if it were unconscious confabulation, if it were people trying to be hucksters and so on, you would think.
Well, I think that, again, we could try to keep it simple. The abduction phenomena, as it's known to us now, could have gotten started in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, or it could have gotten started on a larger scale. And the fact that that was going on could have made let's assume that the contactee stories are false, or largely false, with a small component of actual experience. It could have made it less plausible for people to carry out the same kind of charade. That's one way to deal with it. But I think that a theme that I had in mind to take up before, and one that you allude to and what you were just saying, is that a big portion of this could be counterintelligence. And I think that we could make a good argument for that, in that, as I was saying earlier, the visitors are clearly complicit in the secrecy. They may or may not be directing it in some way, overtly or subtly, but they're clearly complicit in it, because they could blow the whole thing open anytime they want. They might not care whether or not we acknowledge them as a society, but they could clearly force us to acknowledge them as a society. So the fact that they seem to have that motivation to remain unknown means that it's not unreasonable that they, like us, would attention and counterintelligence. We do it. We circulate information that we know that people are going to discover, just to obfuscate what we're really up to. And if it occurs to us, it almost certainly occurs to them. By including some absurd element, you know, I mean, just to reduce it to almost to the level of parody, the beings could say to themselves, hey, you know, when we pick this guy up, let's make sure that we also grab an alligator. So they see us pulling the alligator into the ship. Or let's shovel some dirt randomly and make sure some people see that. So that when they talk about this, it'll just further the agenda of it being unknown. It's not hard to imagine. So it's possible.
I would simply say this. I would say that we're assuming that the more contemporary abduction accounts are in some way less deceptive and more authentic than the contactee accounts, which seem by comparison to be more like bullshit. Well, what if the abduction accounts are equally bullshit? Now, some people approach this question, especially online, and they employ what we can call here the paranoia thesis, which is it's all deception, it's all bullshit. Some people say that it's all bullshit and deception because the entire contactee abductee phenomena combined, they're all the product of intelligence agencies and mind control. That's one theory. The other, of course, is the more metaphysical paranoiac thesis, which is, oh, well, you know, this is just the human consciousness interpreting things, so that's why we have the discrepancies in witness accounts. When two or more people are viewing the same event, one person, like Barney Hill, sees Nazis, and Betty Hill sees, you know, the alien creatures, so on and so forth. But and those are kind of, they're somewhat simple-minded. There's still another way to look at the paranoid thesis, which is that the abduction experiences are fundamentally misleading. And the perfect example of that is look at Strieber.